The room was dimly lit, yet the tension inside blazed like a furnace. Delegates whispered behind their placards, avoiding eye contact as Ilhan Omar took the floor. Her voice was calm, too calm. "This is not the time for anger," she began, looking directly at the African bloc. "If we speak too loudly about Gaza, we will lose what little progress we've made. We must remain silent, for now." That word, silent, rippled through the room like a cold wave. Some lowered their heads. Others shifted in discomfort. But one man did not move, one man did not flinch. Captain Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his gaze burning through Omar like a blade through silk. As the applause faded, he stood. The room turned to him like the tide shifting toward a rising storm. "I was not brought here," Traoré said, "to play diplomat while children die under rubble." His voice, heavy with fury, sliced the silence that had gripped the chamber. "Silence is a luxury of the powerful, but I am not here for their comfort, I am here for the dead." Omar's smile tightened. "Captain, we all mourn, but diplomacy requires patience." "No," Traoré interrupted, his voice now thunder. "Diplomacy without justice is theater, and I refuse to act on your stage." Cameras clicked like distant drums. Delegates sat frozen. The Ghanaian ambassador looked down, the Brazilian rep stopped taking notes, and even the French envoy, a seasoned performer, stared at Traoré with something between awe and fear. He turned toward the world. "Gaza bleeds, and you pass resolutions. Gaza buries its children, and you hold press briefings. You tell us to stay silent, then I will scream until your walls collapse." And with that, the chamber erupted, not in applause, but in gasps. Some in the African bloc stood. Others in Latin America nodded solemnly. Traoré had broken the spell. Ilhan Omar remained seated, her expression unreadable, as if for the first time, someone had held up a mirror too close to her face. But Traoré was not done. He raised a single finger and pointed skyward. "You fear speaking because it costs you votes. I speak because silence costs lives." He stepped back. Not in retreat, but as if making room for history to breathe. Outside the United Nations, chaos bloomed like wildfire. Protesters had gathered from every continent, Palestinian flags waved beside Burkinabe banners, chants collided in 100 languages, but one name was being repeated in rhythm like a war drum: Traoré. 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 Inside the UN hall, however, the atmosphere had fractured. Diplomats shuffled papers, pretending not to hear the crowd's roar beyond the marble walls. But the storm had entered with Traoré, and now it refused to leave. Ilhan Omar stood again, attempting to recover control. "Let us not make this a stage for personal vendettas," she said, carefully avoiding Traoré's gaze. "We need balanced voices, not provocations. Peace is fragile, and inflammatory words can shatter it." Traoré leaned forward at his desk, eyes still locked on her like a hawk circling prey. "Peace," he repeated slowly. "You speak of peace like it's a window you can close when the wind gets rough. But for my people, and for Gaza, peace was never gifted. It was seized, bled for, and buried in mass graves." The room tensed. Several Western delegates shifted in their seats. A few whispered into earpieces. But the African bloc sat still, watching, listening. Knowing. Traoré rose again, and this time he walked toward the center of the chamber. Cameras pivoted. Journalists stopped typing. The silence that met him wasn't fear, it was reverence. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "This," he said, holding it high, "is the ceasefire proposal Ilhan Omar and others drafted." He let it fall to the floor. A document written in soft ink while bombs drop on children. A negotiation with no urgency, no spine, no shame. Ilhan inhaled sharply. "Captain, with respect." "With respect?" Traoré cut her off. "If you respected Gaza, you wouldn't ask for silence. You would demand justice." He turned, this time to face the entire assembly. "I will not silence my voice to protect your positions. I will not sell my soul to earn your applause. And I will not trade the dead for diplomacy." Then he said what no one expected. "If none of you will act, then Africa will." The hall broke, first in gasps, then in shouts. Delegates turned to one another. Some applauded, some objected, but none remained neutral. Ilhan Omar sat down, visibly shaken. Her attempt to calm the fire had instead revealed the spark she thought she could contain. And Ibrahim Traoré stood alone at the center of the world, not as a speaker, but as a storm no one could ignore. The headlines didn't wait. Within hours, Traoré's speech exploded across every screen. African leader shames UN over Gaza. Traoré, if you won't act, Africa will. Ilhan Omar silenced on world stage. On social media, clips of Traoré's confrontation surged past 50 million views overnight. But behind the viral firestorm was something deeper, a shift in global conscience. The world wasn't just watching anymore. It was wondering, what if he's right? In the backrooms of Washington, aides scrambled. State Department officials whispered terms like damage control and narrative management. Meanwhile, Ilhan Omar found herself under pressure from both sides. Progressives called her a traitor, conservatives mocked her weakness, and within her own circle, silence was becoming its own kind of betrayal. Traoré, on the other hand, wasn't done. At a press briefing the next day, surrounded by a wall of African flags, he addressed the world directly. I did not come here to make enemies, he began. But I also didn't come to shake hands with hypocrisy. The reporters leaned in. When Israel bombs schools, the world says, wait for peace. When Gaza's children cry, the world says, let's not be political. But when we defend them, that's when you call us dangerous. He held up a photo, bloodied children beneath rubble, dated just 48 hours ago. This is not a political debate. This is a genocide. A sharp silence hung in the air. One Western journalist dared to ask, Captain Traoré, are you accusing the United States and its allies of complicity? He didn't flinch. I am not accusing, he replied. I am stating the obvious. Their silence is their signature. Ilhan Omar released a statement that night, calling Traoré's remarks divisive and unhelpful. But even her words sounded hollow now, like paper shields in a storm of truth. And Traoré's storm was just beginning. The next day, Traoré stood before the General Assembly, not as a guest, but as a reckoning. He didn't read from a script. His words, raw and deliberate, struck harder than any prepared speech. You speak of democracy, he began, scanning the rows of stone-faced diplomats, but you fund bombs that fall on children. You speak of peace, but only after the bodies are buried. The Israeli delegation shifted uncomfortably. Ilhan Omar sat in the Minnesota section, her eyes downcast. A moment hung, thick with tension, fragile with truth. Traoré continued. I was told to stay in my place. I was told that Africa should not interfere. But Gaza is not just Palestine's wound, it is humanity's wound. Gasps rippled through the chamber. I hear leaders say, let's wait for investigations. He held up a tablet, flicking through photo after photo, children with missing limbs, mothers clutching lifeless infants, concrete soaked in red. But the dead don't need investigations. They need justice. Cameras zoomed in, phones lit up, some diplomats walked out. Others, surprisingly, stayed. At that moment, Ilhan Omar stood. For the first time, she spoke. Captain Traoré. Do you believe Africa can stop this war? He looked her in the eye. The room froze. No, he said calmly. But I believe you could have. And you chose not to. The words hit like thunder. History will remember, he added, his voice unshaking. Not just those who dropped the bombs, but those who looked away. She sat down slowly. No reply. Later that evening, hashtags surged across every platform. Hashtag Traoré Truth. Hashtag Voice for Gaza. Hashtag Silence is Complicity. And from Nairobi to New York, Cairo to Cape Town, one message rang louder than the rest. Traoré wasn't just speaking. He was breaking the silence, with the fury of a continent behind him. The backlash was immediate. In Washington, conservative pundits called Traoré a destabilizing force. Israeli officials labeled him a propagandist in uniform. And in private, Ilhan Omar's aides scrambled to manage the fallout. But it was too late. Across social media, Traoré's speech had ignited something deeper than outrage. It awakened conscience. People weren't just reposting his words, they were translating them into Arabic, Swahili, French, Spanish. In refugee camps, his video played on phones held by trembling hands. In student halls, it echoed over projectors. The world was listening, not because he was powerful, but because he was right. And Ilhan Omar? She had a choice. That night, under pressure from both activists and allies, she requested a private meeting with Traoré. He agreed, but only under one condition: no press, no aides, just a room, 2 chairs, and the truth. Inside, she opened with tension masked as grace. "I wasn't trying to silence Gaza. I was trying to prevent more deaths." Traoré leaned forward. "And how many more will die while you calculate your tone?" Her jaw tightened. "You think I don't care?" "I think you're afraid," he said, softly. "Afraid that speaking too loud will cost you votes. Afraid that telling the truth will get you labeled." Silence. He stood, then walked to the door, hand on the knob. "You don't have to shout," he added. "But whispering isn't an option anymore." He left her there, alone with her reflection. By morning, a headline splashed across digital walls. He didn't shame her, he showed her the mirror. And underneath it, a quote from a new editorial. "Traoré is not here to win elections. He's here to wake the sleeping." Ilhan Omar didn't speak to the press for 3 days. Not a single tweet. No interviews. No carefully drafted statements. Just silence. But behind closed doors, a storm brewed. Her team debated damage control. Advisors pushed for a pivot. Donors whispered ultimatums. Yet something had shifted. She wasn't thinking like a politician anymore. On the 4th day, she emerged, not on the steps of Congress, not in front of CNN cameras, but at a community mosque in Minneapolis. No lights, no podium, just people. Mostly women. Many in hijab. A few holding photos, of Gaza, of rubble, of blood. Ilhan stood before them, clutching nothing but a worn notebook. "When I first ran for office," she began, "I said I would speak for the voiceless. But somewhere along the way, I started listening to polls instead of people. I chose caution over courage. And I forgot that silence is a luxury the dying do not have." She paused, her voice cracking. "Captain Traoré reminded me of that." The crowd murmured. Phones went up. Live streams flickered on. And just like that, the narrative turned. That night, a new video surfaced, not leaked, but published deliberately. Traoré, standing under a starlit sky, recorded from an undisclosed base in the Sahel. "I have no interest in humiliating leaders," he said. "But I do care whether they speak when it matters. If my words forced a mirror into someone's hands, I hope they use it, not to admire themselves, but to see who's behind them." He raised his hand to the camera. "For the mothers digging through rubble. For the children drawing freedom in the sand. For the voices buried under silence, keep speaking." By morning, hashtags merged. Hashtag Traoré speaks. Hashtag Omar woke. Hashtag Gaza lives. And in the world's eyes, the lines had blurred. It was no longer about who said what first. It was about who dared to keep saying it when the world told them to stop. Washington seethed. Traoré's latest video hadn't just reignited Ilhan Omar's stance, it had lit a fire that now threatened to burn through the carefully curated image of American neutrality. The State Department scrambled. Spokespeople were briefed. Intelligence analysts reviewed every word of Traoré's address like it was a code. But the real battle wasn't in backroom briefings or PR meetings. It was in the hearts of the youth. In Atlanta, murals of Traoré began to appear beside Malcolm X and Angela Davis. In Detroit, chants of "Traoré speaks, we rise" echoed through college campuses. And in Brooklyn, a teenage girl edited a video that spliced Traoré's speech over footage of bombs falling on Gaza. It hit 12 million views in 2 days. This wasn't diplomacy. This was disruption. And in D.C., Ilhan Omar received a sealed envelope from an anonymous courier. Inside was a single photo, a mass grave, children wrapped in shrouds, with one word handwritten across the top: speak. She didn't hesitate. That night, she stood before Congress again. This time, her voice didn't waver. "I was elected to tell the truth," she said. "And the truth is this: America funds war. America sells weapons. And when we are silent, we are complicit." Gasps. Murmurs. A few stood to leave. But Traoré had changed something in her. She didn't chase their approval. "My loyalty isn't to comfort. It's to conscience." News outlets lost their minds. Fox called her a traitor. MSNBC called her brave. But the people, they just called her human. And halfway across the world, in a bunker lit by candles and strategy maps, Traoré watched the clip. He didn't smile. He simply nodded. Another spark had caught flame. And the fire was only growing. The White House was rattled. Ilhan Omar's defiance had set off shockwaves, but it was the response from the global south that turned tremors into an earthquake. Across Africa, leaders once hesitant to speak were now stepping forward, emboldened by Traoré, inspired by Omar, enraged by silence. And the spark? A single line Traoré spoke in a new broadcast from Ouagadougou. "When voices in America break the silence, it is no longer a battle between nations. It is a reckoning for humanity." The line went viral within hours. In South Africa, students held night vigils with candles forming the shape of Gaza. In Kenya, artists projected Traoré's image onto parliament walls, his words echoing with the beat of ancestral drums. In Haiti, a poet wrote, "Our chains have changed, but Traoré shows us the key was always in our hands." Washington couldn't contain it. CNN invited Traoré for a live virtual debate. He accepted. But with a condition: Ilhan Omar would join him. She did. It was a broadcast unlike any before. No filters, no handshakes, no diplomacy. Just raw truth. And when the host, sweating under studio lights, asked Traoré, "Are you anti-American?" he didn't flinch. "No," Traoré said calmly. "But I am anti-empire. And I am done watching children die while leaders count contracts." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was powerful. It was the silence of millions absorbing a truth they could no longer unsee. That night, both Traoré and Omar trended globally. But not as politicians. As voices. As fire. The tide had shifted, and Washington knew it. Within days of the Traoré-Omar broadcast, congressional offices were flooded with calls. Not just from activists. From veterans. Teachers. Parents. Even former government officials. Voices once silent were now erupting with a singular demand. End the hypocrisy. The White House, scrambling to contain the fallout, released a vague statement praising diverse opinions in a thriving democracy. But it was too late. The mask had slipped, and Traoré wasn't done. He called a press conference. Not in Burkina Faso. But in Dakar. And standing beneath the blazing West African sun, he announced something no leader had dared to propose. A Pan-African coalition will begin formal investigation into foreign military operations on our soil, American, French, Israeli. We will not be targets in someone else's war. Reporters gasped. Within hours, U.S. diplomats were on red alert. Netanyahu's office issued a statement calling Traoré's actions reckless and dangerous. But Traoré had already prepared his response, and it didn't come through a press release. It came through satellite footage. Broadcast across Africa and leaked online, the video showed newly uncovered bunkers, foreign weapons stockpiles hidden under U.S. protected bases, and shipment logs linking them directly to Israeli contractors. Peace, Traoré said into the camera, is not made by the hands that build bunkers. Ilhan Omar retweeted the footage with 3 words. Now explain this. Suddenly, the narrative had flipped. It was no longer Traoré or Omar on trial. It was the empire. And the world was watching with its finger on rewind. New York. The UN General Assembly. The chamber was full, but the tension made it feel hollow, like a temple waiting for judgment. Security doubled. Journalists restless. Delegates alert. Because today, the world knew, Traoré would speak last. Ilhan Omar walked in quietly and took her seat. She didn't look left or right. She didn't have to. Everyone had already heard the whispers. She had refused to retract her comments. She had refused to distance herself from Traoré. And when his name was called, the cameras almost missed it. He didn't walk in like a man seeking applause. He walked like a man carrying truth. Clad in traditional Burkinabe robes, no tie, no flag behind him, just the stare of someone who had nothing to lose and nothing left to fear. He began with silence. 20 seconds. Then, he spoke. You bomb children and call it defense. You finance death and call it diplomacy. You silence dissent and call it peace. We see through you now. Gasps. Murmurs. The Israeli delegation stood to leave, but stopped. Because Traoré turned and looked directly at Netanyahu. If you believe peace is made through silence, then hear this. Africa will no longer whisper. Gaza will not be forgotten. And I will not stop until every grave has a name, and every name has justice. He stepped back from the mic. Not a word. Not a movement. Then, applause. First from the African bloc. Then South America. Asia. Even a few in Europe. Omar stood. And the room followed. As Traoré walked out, the world didn't just hear him. It followed him. Because he wasn't just a president anymore. He had become something else. A reckoning.